They say the truth always finds its way to the surface. Like water seeping through cracks, it pushes and pushes until it breaks free. I never believed that until I came back to Chelmsford, until I met little Sophie Hayes, until I learned what really happened to my sister Marion 15 years ago. My name is Isabel Turner, and this is the story of how a 6-year-old girl helped me destroy the man who murdered my family. The moving truck pulled away from 42 Elm Street on a Tuesday morning in October. I stood on my new porch, breathing in the crisp autumn air of my childhood town. 15 years. That's how long I'd been running from this place. But divorce has a way of stripping you bare. When my marriage fell apart and my parents passed within months of each other, Chelmsford was all I had left. The old Turner house had been sold long ago, but this little cottage on Elm Street would do. It was cheap, it was quiet, it was far enough from my old neighborhood to feel safe. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent my entire adult life building walls, creating distance, changing my last name from Turner to my ex-husband's name, anything to escape the shadow of what happened to Marion. But here I was, 33 years old and broke, crawling back to the very place that had destroyed my family. My therapist back in Boston had called it confronting your trauma. I called it desperation. The cottage was smaller than it looked. In the photos, 2 bedrooms, 1 bath, a kitchen that hadn't been updated since the 1980s, but it had good bones, the realtor had said. Good bones and a history I didn't know yet. I was carrying my second box from the car when I noticed her watching me. Are you the new neighbor? I turned to find a small girl standing at the edge of my driveway. She couldn't have been more than 6, with blonde curls that should have looked angelic, but somehow didn't. Her eyes were too old for her face, too. Knowing, she was staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I'm Isabel, I said, forcing a smile and setting down the box. What's your name? Sophie Hayes. She pointed to the 2-story house next door with a small, thin finger. I live there with my daddy. Something about the way she said daddy made me pause. There was a flatness in her voice, like she was reading from a script she'd memorized. But didn't understand. Where's your mommy? I asked gently. Sophie's face went completely blank. For a moment, she looked like a little robot whose batteries had died. Mommy fell down the stairs. Her head cracked like an egg. The casual way she said it made my blood run cold. No child should talk about death with such detachment. Before I could respond, a man's voice boomed from the Hayes house. Sophie, get inside, now! The little girl's whole body tensed like she'd been struck. Without another word, she ran toward her house, her small legs pumping as fast as they could carry. She didn't look back. I watched her disappear through the front door, and something cold settled in my stomach, something familiar. The same feeling I'd had as a child when I knew something was wrong but couldn't name it. The same feeling I'd had the week before Marion died. The first drawing appeared in my mailbox 3 days later. It was crude, the kind of art you'd expect from a child. Stick figures drawn in crayon on construction paper. But there was something disturbing about it that made my hands shake as I held it. One figure was tall with angry black scribbles for a face and sharp teeth drawn in red crayon. Another was smaller, lying on the ground with red marks around the head that looked too much like blood. At the bottom, in shaky letters that looked like they'd been written in the dark, someone had written, "Mommy hurt." I stood in my driveway staring at it for a long time. Cars passed by. Mrs. Chun from down the street walked her dog. Life went on normally around me while I held this piece of paper that felt like evidence of something terrible. I crumpled it up and threw it away. Kids draw strange things all the time, right? They process grief differently. Maybe this was just Sophie's way of dealing with losing her mother. But I kept thinking about the way she'd said it. Her head cracked like an egg. What kind of child talks like that? The second drawing came the next day. This time, there were 3 figures. The tall, angry one, the small one on the ground, and a new figure, even smaller, with yellow curls that were unmistakably meant to be Sophie. This one had tears drawn down its face, and its mouth was open in what looked like a scream. At the bottom, Sophie scared. My hands shook as I stared at it. This wasn't random childhood art. This wasn't grief processing. This was a cry for help. From a little girl who didn't know how else to ask for it. I looked toward the Hayes house, my heart pounding. In the upstairs window, I could see Sophie watching me. When our eyes met, she quickly ducked behind the curtains, but not before I saw her press a small hand against the glass. She was trying to tell me something. But what? The third drawing arrived that evening, tucked under my windshield wiper like a parking ticket. This one was different, darker. It showed the tall figure standing over two smaller figures, one with yellow hair, one with brown hair like mine. Both small figures had X's drawn over their eyes. At the bottom, in letters that looked like they'd been pressed so hard the crayon had broken, "Help me." That's when I made my first mistake. I should have called child services. I should have called the police. Instead, I walked straight to Douglas Hayes' front door and knocked. Because somewhere deep in my gut, I knew this wasn't just about Sophie. This was about Marion too. This was about the man who'd been watching children in Chelmsford for decades. And I was finally close enough to stop him. Douglas Hayes was exactly what you'd expect from a small-town predator trying to hide in plain sight. Tall, clean-cut, with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He answered the door in a crisp white shirt, looking like he'd stepped out of a furniture catalog. "You must be our new neighbor," he said, extending his hand. His grip was too firm, held too long. "Douglas Hayes, welcome to the neighborhood. Isabel Turner, I wanted to introduce myself and, well, I've been finding some drawings in my mailbox. Children's drawings."
His smile flickered for just a moment.
"Drawings? Stick figures, crayon art. I think they might be from Sophie. Sophie doesn't leave the property without permission." His voice was still friendly, but there was steel underneath. "She's been through a trauma, you understand. Lost her mother in an accident last year. Sometimes she acts out. Of course, I just thought you should know." "I appreciate that." He stepped closer, just inside my personal space. "Sophie needs stability right now, routine. I hope we can count on you to not encourage any unusual behavior." The threat was clear, even wrapped in neighborly concern. I nodded and backed away, but as I turned to leave, I saw Sophie in the upstairs window again. She was holding up another drawing. This one showed the tall figure with its hands around the smaller figure's neck. I couldn't sleep that night. Something about Douglas Hayes felt familiar in the worst way. I kept thinking about Sophie's drawings, about the way she flinched when he called her name. And then, like a punch to the gut, I remembered. 15 years ago, when I was 12 and Marion was 8, we'd lived on Maple Street just 3 blocks from Elm Street. Marion had been walking home from her friend Emma's house when it happened. "They found her in Miller's Creek," said she must have slipped and hit her head on the rocks. But Marion was a good swimmer. She knew those woods better than anyone. She was careful. Always followed the path Mom had shown her. And she'd been scared of something in the weeks before she died. She kept saying a man had been following her, watching her from the trees. My parents thought it was just imagination. "There's a scary man, Izzy," she'd whispered to me one night, crawling into my bed. "He knows my name. He asked me if I wanted to see something special." I should have told Mom and Dad. I should have taken her seriously, but I was 12 and stupid and thought she was just being dramatic. The last time I saw my sister alive, she was skipping down our front steps with her purple hair ribbon bouncing in the sunlight. She turned and waved at me, her gap-toothed smile bright as always. "See you later, Izzy," she called. But I never saw her again, not alive. The police closed the case quickly. Accident, case closed. My family moved away within the month, too broken to stay in a place that had taken our baby girl. Mom never recovered. She spent years blaming herself, wondering what she'd missed. Dad threw himself into work, never talking about what happened. Our family fell apart piece by piece. Now, sitting in my new kitchen, I pulled up old newspaper archives on my laptop. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for.
Local.
Man Questiones in Child's Death, August 15, 2005. The article was short, buried on page 3. Douglas Hayes, then 28, had been questioned in connection with the death of 8-year-old Marion Turner. He was released without charges due to lack of evidence. The article mentioned he worked part-time as a groundskeeper for the Parks Department. Miller's Creek was part of his territory. There was his photo, younger but unmistakably him, the same cold eyes, the same fake smile. My sister hadn't slipped and fallen, she'd been murdered, and her killer had been living 3 blocks away from us all along. I had to be smart about this. 15 years had passed. Douglas had a new victim now, his own daughter. If I moved too fast, if I made him suspicious, he might run or worse, he might hurt Sophie. So I became the friendly neighbor. I baked cookies every other day, chocolate chip, oatmeal raisin, snickerdoodles, the kind my mother used to make for Marion when she was scared. I waved from my garden when Douglas came home from work. I made small talk about the weather at the mailbox. I waited, but I also watched. I learned Douglas's schedule down to the minute. Sophie was harder to reach. Whenever I saw her outside, Douglas wasn't far behind, watching from windows or the front porch. But children are clever when they need to be. 3 weeks after I'd moved in, I found her hiding behind my garden shed. "Hi, Sophie," I said softly, pretending to tend my roses while my heart hammered against my ribs. "How are you today?"
Daddy
says I shouldn't talk to you. Her voice was barely a whisper, so quiet I had to strain to hear her. "He says you ask too many questions." That sent a chill down my spine. Too many questions about what? That's okay. We don't have to talk. We can just dear. We stood in silence for a few minutes. I pruned dead blooms while Sophie crouched in the dirt, drawing patterns with a stick. She was so thin I could see the knobs of her spine through her t-shirt. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, she said, "The basement is where he keeps the bad things." My blood turned to ice. What kind of bad things? Pictures and
Mommy's
necklace, the one she was wearing when she fell, and other things that belonged to the girls in the pictures. I knelt down to her level, careful not to scare her, careful not to let my voice shake. "Sophie, honey, did you see what happened to Mommy?" Tears started rolling down her cheeks, making clean tracks through the dirt on her face. She found the pictures in Daddy's basement. Pictures of other little girls with no clothes on. She said she was going to tell the police. And Daddy got really mad and grabbed her neck and... She couldn't finish, but she didn't need to. I understood. With a clarity that made me want to vomit. "Sophie, I need to ask you something very important. Do you remember a little girl named Marion?" She had brown hair like mine, but she was smaller. Sophie's eyes went wide with recognition. The girl in Daddy's special box. He has her backpack. And her purple hair ribbon. He talks to her picture sometimes when he thinks I'm sleeping. The world tilted sideways. My sister's purple hair ribbon, the one she never went anywhere without. The one the police said they never found. The one Douglas Hayes had been keeping as a trophy for 15 years. I could have gone to the police then, should have, but who would believe an old story about pictures in a basement? Douglas would claim she was traumatized, confused. He'd done it before. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I needed to make him reveal himself. So I started my own investigation. I researched Douglas Hayes going back years. What I found made me sick. His first wife, Helen, hadn't been his first victim. I found records of 3 other suspicious deaths over the past 20 years. All women who'd gotten too close to the truth, all ruled accidents or suicides. In 2015, Clara Martinez, a teacher who'd reported concerns about Douglas watching children at the playground, found dead in her bathtub, ruled suicide despite having no history of mental illness. In 2018, Janet Kowalski, a social worker who'd started asking questions about Helen's death. Car accident on a clear day on a straight road she'd driven 1,000 times. In 2020, Rebecca Smith, a neighbor who'd complained about Douglas's behavior toward her teenage daughter overdose, even though friends swore she never touched drugs. Each death happened just weeks after these women had started asking the wrong questions. Each investigation was closed quickly with barely any follow-up. Douglas wasn't just a child killer, he was a serial killer who'd been flying under the radar for decades, eliminating anyone who got too close to his secrets, but he'd made one mistake. He'd kept trophies. And his 6-year-old daughter knew where they were. I spent the next 2 weeks learning everything I could about Douglas Hayes, His work schedule, his routines, his habits. I needed to know my enemy before I could destroy him. Every evening, I watched from my kitchen window as he came home from his job at the hardware store. He had a ritual: check the mail, look around the neighborhood like he was surveying his territory, then disappear into his house with Sophie trailing behind him like a scared shadow. I think it's time I properly introduce myself to the neighborhood, I told Mrs. Chen from down the street one day. Would you help me organize a little dinner party? Nothing fancy, just a chance to meet everyone. Mrs. Chen loved the idea. Within a week, she'd convinced half of Elm Street to attend, including Douglas Hayes. What a lovely thought, he said when I invited him personally. Sophie and I would be delighted to come. Oh, bring Sophie by all means. I'd love to get to know her better. That night, I prepared carefully. I wasn't planning to present evidence. I was planning something much more devastating. I was going to let the truth speak for itself. The dinner party was perfect. 15 neighbors crammed into my small living room, sharing stories and getting to know the new resident. Douglas was charming, playing the part of the devoted single father beautifully. He told touching stories about Helen, about how hard it had been raising Sophie alone, about the grief they were both still processing. Several of the older ladies were practically in tears listening to him. She was the love of my life, he said, his voice breaking at just the right moment. Some days I don't know how we get through it without her. Sophie sat quietly beside him, coloring in a notebook, but I noticed she flinched every time he mentioned her mother's name. And when Mrs. Chun asked if Helen had been sick before the accident, Douglas's hand tightened on Sophie's shoulder until the little girl winced. I waited until dessert was served and everyone was relaxed, full of good food and wine. That's when I struck. Sophie's such a talented little artist, I said, pulling out the papers I'd collected from my mailbox. She's been leaving the most interesting pictures for me. I spread them out on the coffee table. The room went quiet as people took in the crude but unmistakable scenes of violence, stick figures with red crayon blood, drawings of someone falling downstairs, pictures of a man with angry scribbles for a face standing over smaller figures. Kids draw the strangest things, Douglas said quickly, reaching for the papers. His voice was still calm, but I could see a vein pulsing in his temple. Sophie's been having nightmares since her mother died. But Sophie was staring at the drawings, with wide eyes, like she was seeing them for the first time, spread out like evidence. And then, in the silence of the room, she spoke. That's when Daddy pushed Mommy down the stairs. She found the pictures in the basement, pictures of the dead little girls. You could have heard a pin drop, Mrs. Peterson gasped and covered her mouth. Mr. Yang leaned forward like he couldn't believe what he'd just heard. Sophie, honey, Douglas said, his voice tight with warning. You know that's not what happened. Mommy fell because she was tired and it was dark. No, she didn't. Sophie's voice was getting stronger, braver with each word. I saw you do it. I was hiding on the stairs. I saw you put your hands on Mommy's neck and squeeze until she stopped moving. Then you carried her to the stairs and made it look like she fell. And then you told me if I ever told anyone, you'd do the same thing to me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. I could see the horror growing on my neighbors' faces as they realized what they were hearing. Douglas stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. She's confused, traumatized. Children make up stories when they're scared. Like the story about Marion Turner? I said quietly. The room went dead silent. Several neighbors gasped. Everyone in Chelmsford remembered that case. Douglas's face went white. I don't know what you're talking about. Sophie told me about your special box in the basement. The one with the purple hair ribbon and the little backpack. You've been filling her head with lies, he snarled, all pretense of friendliness gone. Sophie, we're leaving now. But Sophie didn't move. Instead, she looked around the room at all the adult faces staring at her father with horror and disgust. Tell them about the other girls, Daddy, she said, with the devastating honesty only children possess. Tell them about their pictures in your box. Tell them why you keep their hair. That's when Douglas completely lost control. Shut up. He screamed at Sophie, lunging toward her. You stupid little brat. I should have gotten rid of you years ago. 3 neighbors grabbed him before he could reach his daughter. He fought like a wild animal, screaming obscenities, making threats, revealing exactly the kind of monster he really was. "I'll kill all of you," he shrieked as Mr. Peterson pinned his arms, "just like I killed that little bitch Marion. Just like I killed my wife. You can't prove anything." Someone was calling 911. Someone else was comforting Sophie, who had finally started crying, not from fear, but from relief. The whole room was in chaos, except for me. I walked over to where Douglas was being restrained and knelt down so we were eye to eye. "This isn't justice," I whispered so only he could hear. "This is revenge, for my sister Marion. For your wife Helen, for every child you hurt and every family you destroyed." His eyes went wide as he finally recognized me, as he realized who I was and why I'd really come back to Chelmsford. "You planned this," he breathed. "Every single detail," I confirmed. "And the beautiful thing is, I didn't have to plant any evidence. I didn't have to lie. I just had to give you enough rope to hang yourself with." The police arrived then, along with child services. As they led Douglas away in handcuffs, he was still screaming about being set up, about how no one would believe a crazy kid and a vindictive neighbor. But everyone had heard him confess. Everyone had seen him lose control and threaten his own daughter. There would be no getting out of this one. The search warrant came through the next morning. I wasn't allowed inside the Hayes house, but I watched from my window as investigators carried out box after box of evidence. Detective Morrison, the lead investigator, came to speak with me around noon. She was a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. "We found everything," she said simply. "Sophie was telling the truth about all of it. She couldn't give me details, it was an ongoing investigation. But she could confirm that they'd found extensive evidence in the basement, photographs dating back decades, personal items from victims, detailed journals documenting Douglas's crimes. Your sister's belongings were exactly where Sophie said they'd be," Detective Morrison told me gently. "Her backpack, her hair ribbon, and things. We'll need you to formally identify them, but I wanted you to know we found them." I nodded, not trusting my voice. 15 years of wondering, of imagining the worst. And it turned out the worst wasn't even close to the reality. "How many?" I finally managed to ask. "We're still processing everything, but preliminary count suggests at least 23 victims over a span of 25 years. Your sister was one of his earliest victims. We found school photos, newspaper clippings about her death. He kept detailed records of each victim. 23 children, 23 families destroyed while Douglas Hayes walked free, worked at the hardware store, coached Little League baseball, played the role of the perfect neighbor." "There's something else," Detective Morrison said. "We found video footage, not just photographs."
He recorded some of his crimes. I thought I was going to be sick.
"Marion, we're still reviewing everything, but yes, I'm sorry." The forensic team worked for 3 days. When they were done, they'd connected Douglas Hayes to 17 murders across 3 states. The perfect neighbor, the devoted father, had been one of the most prolific serial killers in the region's history. Sophie had been right about everything. The basement had been his trophy room, his shrine to the lives he'd taken, each victim carefully catalogued, their final moments preserved for his sick pleasure. But Sophie had also been his downfall. Her innocent drawings had led me to the truth. Her brave testimony had exposed him to the community. Her courage had finally brought justice for all his victims, including my sister Marion. Sophie came to stay with me temporarily while the state worked out permanent placement. Her aunt in California wanted custody, and I thought that was best. The child needed to get as far away from this place as possible. Those 2 weeks with Sophie were some of the hardest and most healing of my life. She was so small, so damaged, but also incredibly resilient. She helped me cook dinner every night, standing on a step stool to reach the counter. She asked questions about everything. Why onions make you cry, why birds can fly, why some people hurt children. Were you scared when you were little? She asked me one evening as we folded laundry together. Sometimes, I admitted, especially after my sister died. I was scared it might happen to me too. But it didn't. No, it didn't. And it won't happen to you either. You're safe now. She was quiet for a while, carefully matching sock pairs with the concentration of a surgeon. I used to wish Mommy would come back, she said finally, but now I think she's happy where she is. She doesn't have to be scared anymore. Children have a way of understanding things that adults struggle with. Sophie had processed her trauma in ways that amazed the therapist she was seeing. She drew pictures now too, but they were different. Bright colors, happy faces, flowers and rainbows and houses with smoke coming from the chimneys. On our last night together, she climbed into my lap while I was reading on the couch. "Are you sad your sister is gone?" she asked with the direct honesty of children. "Every day," I told her. "But knowing the truth helps. Knowing that the person who hurt her can never hurt anyone else helps." "I'm glad you came to live next door," Sophie said. "I was so scared before, but you made me brave." "You were always brave, sweetheart. You just needed someone to believe you." She was quiet for a long time, tracing patterns on my arm with her. Small finger, "Will you visit me in California?" "As often as I can," I promised, "and you can call me anytime you want. Day or night, even if I have bad dreams. Especially if you have bad dreams." The day she left, I gave her a photo of Marion and me from when we were kids. We were building a sandcastle at the beach, both of us covered in sand and grinning at the camera. "That's your sister?" Sophie asked, studying the photo carefully. "That's Marion. She was about your age in that picture. She looks happy." She was the happiest kid I ever knew. "Just like you're going to be." Douglas Hayes pled guilty to 17 counts of first-degree murder to avoid the death penalty. He was sentenced to 17 consecutive life sentences with no possibility of parole. The trial made national news. "Serial killer exposed by daughter's drawings" was the headline in USA Today. Sophie's face was never shown, but her courage inspired other children to come forward about abuse they'd suffered in silence. I stayed in Chelmsford for another year, long enough to see Douglas's house demolished, and Sophie's aunt gain full custody, long enough to plant a memorial garden where Marion's body had been found, long enough to heal. Sophie writes me letters from California. Her handwriting gets better with each one, her stories brighter and more hopeful. She's doing well in school, seeing a good therapist, learning to be a normal kid again. Her aunt sends photos sometimes. Sophie at the beach, Sophie on a horse, Sophie laughing with new friends. In every picture she's smiling, really smiling, not the forced expression I'd seen that first day in my driveway. "Dear Isabel," her latest letter reads, "I learned to swim. Aunt Jenny says I'm like a fish. I'm not scared of water anymore. I'm not scared of basements either. We don't have one in our new house, but even if we did, I wouldn't be scared because I know monsters can't hide forever. You taught me that, love, Sophie. As for me, I finally found peace, not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from knowing the truth, from knowing that monsters can be defeated, even when it takes 15 years. The house on Elm Street sold quickly to a young family with twin boys. Before they moved in, I met with them personally to tell them the history, not to scare them, but because they deserved to know. They thanked me for my honesty and promised to fill the house with laughter again. I moved to Colorado Springs eventually, started fresh in a place with no ghosts. But I kept the newspaper clippings about Douglas's conviction, not for revenge, that was finished, for hope. Because sometimes the truth does find its way to the surface. Sometimes children are braver than adults give them credit for. Sometimes justice patient, but it always comes, and sometimes when you think all is lost, a little neighbor girl will show you the way home. Last month I got a package in the mail, no return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. Inside was a drawing, not the dark, desperate artwork from those first terrifying weeks, but something bright and hopeful. It showed two stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun, one tall with brown hair, one small with yellow curls. The bottom, in careful second-grade handwriting, "Thank you for believing me. Love, Sophie." I framed it and hung it in my kitchen, right next to the photo of Marion and me from our last Christmas together. The truth had set us both free, and sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light is just right, I swear I can see my sister smiling in that old photo, finally at peace knowing her killer would never hurt another child again. They say the truth always finds its way to the surface. They're right.